Snow came soft, as if ashamed to show its face after all the clamor. A hush falling over the godswood that was heavier than any mailed man could bear. It sifted through the red leaves of the heart tree and stacked itself on each saw-toothed leaflet like a prayer the wind forgot to carry away. John stood beneath the carved and bleeding eyes and let the cold settle on his lashes. He did not blink. The bark under his gloved palm felt alive in a way which should not, cold and pulsing. A slow old heartbeat that came up out of the earth and through the weirwood's marrow and into his bones. Somewhere, a raven said a single harsh syllable and left it to hang. The rest of the world held its breath. Ghost moved nearer until the direwolf's shoulder brushed his knee. Even here, under the tree that had witnessed every quiet vow and noisy failure Winterfell could muster since men first dared scratch their names into living wood, Ghost smelled of the ranges beyond the wall, the pelt of snow hairs in his mouth, a whiff of the iron-tanged wind where no man had business. John let his fingers sink into the thick fur at the scruff and felt the wolf's pulse answer the trees, warm and steady. The contrast nearly undid him. It might have, if he had not spent so many years learning that the thing you were about to say you could not bear had been born already and would be again. The pond had skinned over, a blade-thin sheath that held a blurred moon and the black thrust of the tree's reflection. He watched a feather of snow settle onto the ice and not break it. The feather stayed a feather. The ice stayed a skin. He wondered when he had last slept. He heard Bran before he saw him, or rather he felt the air shift, the way a room shifts when a fire is newly attended. Wheels whispered over old paths. The ravens moved from trunk to trunk as if each hop were agreed upon in a language John would never learn. When he looked up, Bran's chair was where the roots curled like knotted fingers. His brother sat back into the drift of the tree's shadow, as patient as if he had grown there. "I looked," Bran said simply. The words were only air until his eyes rose and met John's. And then they were winter itself, clear and unsparing. There must be a keeper, or else there is only hunger. John waited for the rest. He had learned that patience around Bran. Words were never whole when first uttered. They were pieces that needed silence to find each other. "The night does not end because you kill its king," Bran continued. "It spills. A mind holds it. Without that mind it runs like a ditch when the banks give way, and it eats what it touches until new banks are made." "And who makes new banks?" John asked. Ghost shifted his weight. The wind gave a small, chiding whistle through the branches. Bran's gaze did not leave him. The boy who had fallen from a tower had long since learned to live in places men only visited in dreams. And if there was a softness left in him, it was the softness of new snow over black ice. "I saw a circle, a pattern the world made when no one was looking. There was a king set within it. The one who wore frost like flesh is gone. The circle expects another. If there is none, we are all only weather." A footstep on snow, careful but not timid. A step that understood spectacle and avoided it. A pull of red hair in the corner of his sight. A dark blue cloak stitched with foxes and snowflakes that would look gaudy if not for the person inside it. Sansa stood where a child might once have played at castles with carved branches and knitted crowns. Her face set in the worn beauty of a weapon polished each night because it must be. She watched Bran as if weighing him on a scale she had built herself from splinters and lies and the stubborn metals of home. Her eyes went to John last. They softened there, not much, but enough that the snow in him felt it. He wanted to look away. "Must there?" she said, and it was not a question for Bran so much as a refusal to let fate lapse into the room like a careless guest. "Must there be a king at all?" She spoke the last word like it had spoiled in her mouth. "It is not a crown," Bran said. "It is a door. Someone must be its hinge." "A hinge turns," Sansa said sharply. "It swings at another's will. Your door will open onto what, Bran? A field of graves? You ask my brother to tie his life to a thing we do not understand." "We understand hunger," Bran said. "We understand cold. And we understand that someone broke the old banks when ice was made to serve anger instead of law. Men did it. Children who were not children did it. The cut must be mended. It wants to be mended. If no one holds it shut and true, we drown." Ghost's ears pricked. Somewhere behind Sansa, The Godswood's gate sighed and furtive boots whispered on frost. Arya did not so much appear as arrange the space so that she was suddenly the nearest thing in it. Dark hair damp with snow, eyes like a clean blade, a small ghost of a smile at one corner of her mouth to warn the unwary that she had not forgotten how to be a wolf. She came to Jon's side without greeting and bumped his shoulder with hers. He felt how cold she was, heat leached by practice and the need for it, not by weather. He wanted to take her hand and warm it. He did not. "I don't like it," she said, and though she spoke to Bran, she stood with Jon, a little forward, like if the air meant to bite at him, it would need to scrape its teeth on her first. "You never say anything straight." "I say what is," Bran said, as if that ended it, and perhaps it did. "What is," Arya said, "changes." A flicker of wing and a heavier footfall announced the last of the four he had thought might gather in this place. Sam came with his hat in his hands, though he wore no hat. Anxiety a garment he pulled on and off regardless of weather. His smile when he saw Jon was a bruised sort of thing, relief wrapped around too much knowing. It failed him when he saw Bran and Sansa and Arya all fixed in a pattern around the tree like pieces placed before a game whose rules he did not trust. He stopped, swallowed, remembered to breathe. "I found something," he said breathlessly, "in a book that, well, you would have hated it, Jon. There were worms in it and the binding was cracked, and Gilly told me not to touch it with bare hands or I'd catch. Never mind. The point is, I found a thing about the first winters. Not the first, but a winter that remembers the first. Men wrote with antler and ash then. They say the night fell because a promise was pulled apart. They say the promise was between blood and stone, and the one who stood on both was bound to carry the weight of that promise so that neither blood nor stone would break under it." He smiled that small desperate smile again, the one he wore when he feared he was both too stupid and too clever. "If the one bound is broken, the promise runs straight into the world and turns to teeth. But if another with the right feet takes his place upon the stone, if he stands until his legs are the stone, if he bleeds until the blood is the snow, then the world remembers how to be whole." "Books," Arya muttered. "Books always want you to bleed on something." Sam's face went even pinker. "They don't always want, well, sometimes."
"I'm sorry."
That was flippant. There are other parts. The old words aren't exact, but the sense is the same as what Bran says, and when two things agree that don't like each other, I listen. Sansa frowned, and Jon saw her count possibilities in her head the way other women counted stitches. Quick, small motions of thought, incredibly precise and rarely wasted. "If another must stand," she said carefully, "why my brother? Why not someone else with whatever it is this requires?" "Because I've looked," Bran said. "There were 1,000 paths for this winter. On all the ones that end well, he goes north." "Is that how we talk about your brother now?" Arya said in a voice quiet enough to cut stone. "Paths that end well?" Sam, to his credit, flinched as if struck. He looked to Jon then, under the words like a boy asking permission to speak his father's name. "You don't have to," he blurted. "We say must, but even the old books talk around must. They say the world tends. They say this is what it wants. That's not the same thing as need. The world has wanted terrible things when men weren't there to tell it no. The snow had thickened, little knives now, not feathers. The gods would held them all as if it had arms." Jon drew a breath deep enough that it hurt. "I took a vow once," he said. "In this place. I meant it when I spoke it, and I meant it after, when keeping it cost more than saying it did. I don't know whether the gods heard me. It doesn't matter. I heard me." He looked at Sansa and Arya and felt how much the years had taken from them and how much they had taken back. He looked to Bran and saw the boy who had fallen and the creature that remembered falling 1,000 ways and never touched ground. He thought of Sam holding one more book than his arms could carry, still and always trying. The words in his mouth tasted like iron and birch sap. "I don't think we can let the world have this one. I think we keep it." Sansa gave a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. She pressed knuckles to her mouth as if to keep both at bay. "You think you can keep the world," she said. "Of course you do." A stir of heat from the gate and a scorch of scent that the gods would wanted to refuse but could not. You could not ask a tree to turn away a fire it could not outrun. Jon did not move until the person carrying the heat had come fully in and the cold had decided what to do with her. "Are you all very busy whispering under trees?" Daenerys asked lightly, all the softness of her tone polished to a blade's gleam. Her hair was braided in a pattern Jon did not yet know the names of, a map drawn without asking the land's consent. Snow had salted her shoulders and melted there. She left the gate open behind her, as if to make the cold chase her instead of being chased by it. "Your Grace," Sansa said, bowing just so. There was more reverence in the angle of her head to the tree behind them than in anything she gave the queen. Daenerys's gaze flitted over Sansa and Arya and Sam and came to rest on Bran, lingering there a heartbeat longer than she gave the others, something considering in her eyes that was not entirely kind. Then she found Jon. The consideration in her face broke and fell away. The rest remained. It had always remained. "You look as if you've decided a thing and are now wondering how to tell me," she said. There was no anger in it. There was impatience that might curdle into a dozen other things given the wrong nudge. "Tell me." He did not step away from the tree. He did not step toward her. The place where they stood was a line, and he had learned that there were times when a man made life from lines and times when he made death. "There's an old promise," he said. "We broke it. We've been living since in the wake of that break. Bran says it wants a man to hold it closed while the world learns how to be itself again." Sam found the old words for it. Daenerys's face changed very little most days. She had learned to keep things still. Then there were moments like this when the flesh made way for the steel underneath and when the steel sensed a thing it wanted to cut. "And," she said, "what does this old promise want of me?" "It wants something of me," Jon said. A gust of wind ran through the leaves like a hand through hair. Sansa looked at Daenerys and then away and then back, her reason fighting her courtesy. Arya looked nowhere because nowhere is where knives go when they vanish. Bran did not look, which meant he looked everywhere. "No," Daenerys said softly. And then again, with the voice that had made men burn their own names. "No, it's not a throne," Jon said. "It's not. It's worse," she snapped, and the word came out like a spark in dry grass. "A throne I could break. A crown I could melt. This thing you are letting into the world. This law that has not asked us whether we want it. This wants to bite you and be thanked for it. Do not dress it in sweet words. It is not duty if you choose it because you love the taste of loss." "I don't," he said, and she flinched as if the denial itself had struck her. "I've lost enough, and sometimes I'm proud of how little I made of that loss, because if I wasn't proud of it I would never sleep. I don't want this. I don't. But I will stand it if the standing means they live." He jerked his chin toward the buried walls, the muffled roofs, the hundreds of small lives warming hands over small fires and counting flour. "If I don't, the night runs without a bridle. It eats as it goes. It makes a world where your dragons are only lamps in a cave and there is no cave. There are other ways," she insisted, like a woman beating on a door with her bare fists because the child on the other side had gone silent. "There are always other ways. You must find one of them. I did not come across the world so that the man who showed me what it meant to be seen would turn into a story told to frighten children." Arya's mouth moved, something cruel on her tongue that she did not say. Sansa looked like a woman counting backward from a place she had never been. Sam fumbled the hat he did not have and wished himself invisible. Bran said, "When water fills a bowl and there is no rim, the water finds its own edge. It makes a shore where there was none. It does not ask you." "Enough," Daenerys said, and the ravens took to the air at once, an explosion of black leaves. She did not take a step back. She did not take one forward. She simply made stillness into a weapon. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet and each word weighed. "You want to be a gate. I want to be a door. Doors open and close. Gates keep. Do you hear the difference? Your choice leaves me nowhere. If you go north to become a story, you leave me in a place where the story is the only thing that breathes. I will not live like that. If there must be a hinge, let someone else be it. Let someone whose death does not write new whether be it." Not you." She looked at him with eyes that were not begging because she had given up begging long before she learned to speak in her own name. "Not you. I know," he said, and meant it like a prayer. "I know." The snow thickened again and then thinned, as if even weather hesitated at the edge of them. John could have asked for another night. He could have asked for a week and heaved open the time between what he was and what he would be like a stubborn door. He did not ask because he had learned that asking for a thing and getting it are not the same as peace. "We go with you," Arya said. It was not a question. Sansa's face said perhaps, and then perhaps again, each more dangerous than a yes. Sam said, "I am slow, but I will always arrive." Daenerys's face said, "I will burn the path and make you walk where I have burned it." Bran said nothing, which meant the world had answered already. They went north 3 days later. 3 days of slow goodbyes, spoken and unspoken. 3 days of men who did not know they were saying farewell, pressing a hand to a shoulder and calling it chance. 3 days of Ghost pacing every hall as if the wolf meant to mark each stone with a scent it would take the whole of winter to wash away. Jon moved among them like a man at his own feast who kept forgetting to eat. When he laughed with Tormund in front of the great hearth, it sounded like a blade drawn across a whetstone and made every man nearby swear the steel was for him. When he walked with Sansa along the inner rampart and she told him how many sacks of oats were left and how she meant to answer every southern letter with the same letter written backward until they learned who they spoke to, he listened as if the numbers were a story she had been saving for him since he could count. When Arya put a small cloth bundle in his hand and said, "If you can carry the weight of the world, you can carry this," he unwrapped it and found the tiniest wolf carved from bone, its snout broken, its back mended with tin, some child's toy rescued and made again, and he carried it. When Sam came to him with 4 books strapped in leather and said, "This one is for the road and these 3 are for after," Jon took the thin book for the road and put the others in Sansa's keeping, because Sansa kept things and because he had begun to trust that, almost more than he trusted his own hand on his sword. Daenerys he did not say goodbye to alone. The first time he tried, he found Missandei in the doorway of the hall, and the woman's eyes held such private mercies that he fled like a boy caught stealing fruit. The second time he tried, Grey Worm stood like a blade's shadow where a blade's shadow should be, and Jon remembered that not everything that loves you wants you to live. The third time he tried, on the morning of the 3rd day, as Ghost whined in the yard and the sky split gray as a throat, Daenerys came to him on the steps as if she had been waiting for him to learn there would be no easy door. She took his hand in both of hers and put it to her cheek. Her skin was warm because dragons existed. Her breath was warm because she did. "Marry me instead," she said. "A law is a law because a man chooses it. Choose me. Let the world be a storm outside the tent." He had no answers left that did not sound like a traitor to something. He bent and kissed her forehead with the care he had learned kissing Maester Aemon on nights when the old man did not know his own name and thought the snow on his blanket was ash. He said, "I love you," because it was true and because the truth did nothing to the thing that had decided to be. He said, "I will not be a king," and he watched how the words took shape on her face and did not apologize for them. When he turned, he did not look to see whether she watched him go. He knew she did. He did not want to know what it looked like. They went north with Tormund, and men who had followed him before, and with Howland Reed, who arrived at Winterfell like a story crawling out of a fawn. His hair threaded with gray like old lichens, his eyes measuring, his voice the slow, careful dripping of a leak you had to respect. "I know where the cuts are," he said, and he drew them a map in ash and salt on the long table. They put a blade through the world and decided that was wisdom. It was clever instead, and clever breaks if you lean on it. We'll go to a place where they first tried it. A hole remembers itself. So does a wound. The trick is to ask it to remember being closed. Jon told no one else. He did not need an army. He needed witnesses, and not so many that the world took the witnessing for a fight. They rode out under a sky that carried its own light like a woman who had learned to keep a candle in her pocket wherever she went. The courtyards held too many people pretending they had other business as he passed. There were hands raised and not raised, and mouths set and not set. Sansa stood on the inner wall with Bran beside her and her hair was unbound. She looked the way the heart tree did, a living thing resolved to last. She lifted her hand and did not wave it. Arya stood in shadow with her arms folded and a small impatient smile that would last her half a life. When she caught his eye, she dropped the smile and gave him everything else. He nodded and kept the wolf's toy pressed into his palm. Ghost ranged ahead, white against white. Beyond the wall, the air took on the taste of iron filings. The light fanned low and thin. The men did not sing. They saved their breath for laughter and found very little of it. Jon found the old ways had not forgotten him. He knew where the snow would bear and where it would eat you, and he knew how to set a camp so that it dreamed of men. He spoke seldom. When he did, it was to say a word like hold or now, or to point to a line the horizon made and call it a lake. He kept his eyes open at night because he wanted the last things he saw as he was still himself to be everything. Ghost pressed close in darkness and ranged far in dawn. Sometimes Jon thought the wolf went places his eyes could not and came back with scents in his fur that were not of this century. Tormund told stories in a voice like a boulder rolling downhill. Once he told a story about a bear and a woman and then caught himself mid-word and looked at Jon and said, "Maybe not that one." And Jon laughed so hard he choked, because choice among stories is as tender a kindness as any. They found the circle half buried in drift at the edge of a frozen lake that had been a lake before there were names. The stones stood in a broken ring, some sunk to their haunches like tired men, some leaning like drunks, two cleanly split by a force that had not cared for stone. The wind moved across the ice with a voice like the first hour before dawn, telling you what you will be if you keep going and what you will be if you turn back. Jon stood inside the stones and closed his eyes and thought of the heart tree's sap. He thought of the words he had spoken in that old place to men whose faces he could not remember, and he thought of the world making a sound like a shoulder being set back into its socket after it had slipped out and been mistaken for loss. Howland Reed walked the ring and placed small things where the snow showed old scars. A curl of horn, a feather of some bird that had died before the wall rose and still learned to fly through men's stories. A bit of obsidian that had been a mountain's tooth once and might be again given time and fire. He spoke without looking up, to the ice and to the memory inside it. "We are not mending a crown," he said, perhaps because he felt Daenerys's anger in the air still, an ember that had traveled with them. "We are not making a king. We are admitting an error. We are asking the ground to forget the cruel cleverness that carved it." He stopped and looked at Jon with a gaze that made no demands. "And we are asking you to be patient enough to be a rock." Sam shifted from foot to foot. "The texts mention a tool," he said apologetically, as if producing a hammer would give offense. "It isn't strictly necessary if the will is strong. But nothing is strictly necessary if you have enough will, and I've never found that a helpful way to think about mending things." Howland nodded and produced from his bag a shard of something the color of midnight before a moonrise. It looked like glass until the light caught it and made it stone. The edge was not an edge a human hand could be expected to forgive. Jon looked at it and tasted iron again. He put his palm flat to his chest, above his heart, and felt it answer. He had been dead once. He knew what that felt like. This would not be that. This would be the place between. "Will it hurt?" Tormund asked, because he was the only one who would and because he tendered simple questions like meat thrown to a campfire. He did not fear what the burning made. "Yes," Howland said. Tormund nodded, satisfied. "Then it's worth doing." Arya stood at the ring's edge and watched. She had a hand on the hilt at her hip, but she did not draw. Jon did not ask her to come closer or to go. He did not ask Sansa, who could not be here, and he did not ask Daenerys, who was not. He thought of them anyway. He thought of their faces when they were children and when they were not. He thought of Robb and his mother and of a father who had taught him the difference between a man and a sword and then taught him what to do when there was no difference. He thought of Ghost in a snowdrift and of a wall of black stone and of men who had called him brother and meant it. He thought of Sam crying over a bouquet, and of Bran staring at a horizon only he could see, and of Arya's knives and Sansa's ledger, and of a queen with fire in her veins and law in her hands that she could not name because she had been told 1,000 times that law is what men who win call their winning. "Ready," he said, and he meant it. Howland stepped within the circle and the old wind bent its head. He put his free hand flat over John's heart and hummed a song that sounded like a frog's call and a mother's lullaby and the sound a marsh makes when it remembers it was a sea. The shard began to smoke in the cold. "Look at me," Arya said, voice low. John looked. Her mouth was a small, stubborn line. She had changed the world with those hands. She could again. She would always think of ways to do it that men would not expect and would not be ready for. "Stay," he said, and meant at once for her to step and for her to stand. He hoped she would take the meaning she needed. Howland pushed the stone into his chest. Nothing, no battle, no blade, no flogging in wild wind and sleet, no breathless dying with red blooming on snow, had prepared him for the way the cold came. It did not stab. It did not even burn, though perhaps later he would remember it as burning because men like to use fire as a measure for everything. It flooded. It came up from the ground and down from the sky and through the stone and through the hand on his heart and through the glass that was not glass. He felt the cold not just as sensation but as a series of instructions written in the smallest letters on the smallest bones. Be still, it told his blood, and each drop obeyed. Hold, it told his skin, and his skin held. A drum stretched tight over new silence. Hush, it told his breath, and his breath hushed and then stopped, and nothing in him panicked because panic was an activity and there was no activity left. For an instant, there was nothing but old light. It was blue, but that was only because men call it blue when they look up on a clear night and think it means forever. It was colorless and full of color. It was not warmth. It was not cruelty. It was a rule written into the first rock that had cooled enough to have rules written on it. John saw lines, not lines the eye could see, but the paths everything took when everything was allowed to be honest. He saw the way water curved when it wanted, the way snow settled when it did not care whether a branch broke under it, the way breath drew a map in air and then vanished, leaving the map inside a body. He saw the dead the way a river sees stones, not as lives ended or begun, but as shapes dictating the pace of water. He saw the living as the river sees fireflies, bright, small, gone, bright again, making of their brightness a kind of map too. The shard pressed deeper. He did not cry out because crying out would have made a sound, and sound was for things that had not yet agreed to be still. He held a name in his mouth like a coin so that he could pay a ferryman if one appeared. He held another in his teeth, and another in his lungs, and another under his tongue. He held Ghost's scent in his nostrils and the feel of Sansa's cold fingers on his wrist in the courtyard when she had been too proud to take his hand, and the sound of Arya's laugh when she had stolen some boy's apple, and the feel of a cloak younger than he was around his shoulders and the weight of a sword older than he was in his palm. He held the wind over the wall and the heat of a dragon's breath as it passed over him and did not burn him because it was busy laying law somewhere else. He held the words of a vow that had kept a set of men from killing each other despite the world's hunger. He held, and then he ceased holding, not because he had let go but because there was no longer a difference between his hands and what they held. He heard Ghost howl. He heard a woman far south say his name and break it like glass on a stone. He heard Sam sob and hiccup and stifle the sound as if embarrassed at a funeral. He heard Howland Reed say, "There," in a voice that had not meant there forever. He heard nothing else ever again in the way he had heard things before. When he opened his eyes, the world breathed in with him and then remembered it wasn't breathing and fell still out of respect. The men at the edge of the ring stepped back as if he had grown, though he had not. Ghost came forward on soundless feet and gazed up. The wolf's eyes, always red in snow, now reflected not his face but the sky. John, if the name was still a thing that fit him, looked down and saw himself the way ice sees a man standing on it, as weight and heat and the trouble heat makes. He saw more. He saw the pattern at the circle's heart knit, one knot and one knot and one knot, a series of small obediences that became a new law. He felt the night, not the black but the architecture inside it, settle around his shoulders. He lifted his hand. It was his hand. It was also a thing frost had carved from breath. The skin was pale not with blood's retreat but with a new kind of light that seemed to come from beneath the skin and be both light and its opposite. The men flinched. He did not. They came to him because they must. They rose from ice and from drifts and from where bones had slept all winter in old places, and they came. They were not wights, not the frantic, brittle puppets that had frightened even themselves. These were the pale riders the South had never really believed in, the ones who moved like dawn over frozen water, without ripple. Their eyes were the color of the cold he had just learned to name correctly. They arranged themselves as if they had always belonged in that air. They stood and did not speak, because the speech that would have made meaning would have been a breaking of the quiet that had just been made whole again. They waited for instruction because that was what they were. He knew what he could do because the knowledge lived in the new bloodlessness. Like salt is folded into the sea. He could lift his hand and call under snow until the ground itself lifted up, bones clicking in it like ice breaking. He could send, and what he sent would not tire. He could take, and what he took would not forgive or remember. He could lower his hand, and the wind would lie down like a dog. He could close an eye, and every eye of ice for 100 leagues would close with him, and the world would be less seen and therefore kinder. He could open, and the wind would knife, and the world would be honest. He tried none of these. He was afraid of how easy it all was. He turned that fear into a word and sent it down like water poured over stones into the dead who stood before him. Halt, the word said, though his mouth did not shape it. Watch. He felt their obeisance as one feels a fence except the post you set into it. A small, satisfying give, then a hold. He thought of them as a wall. He thought of himself as the place where the wall had been broken and now was not. Howland Reed was crying. He did it in the careful way of a practical man, as if he meant to conserve even his grief for future use. Sam's tears were not careful. Arya did not weep. Her eyes were steady and the color of old wolves, and inside them was the ferocity you give only to those who have taken something from you and been left alive afterward. Tormund had nothing like pity in his no-nonsense face. He nodded once. "It's you," he said. "All right, John Nightman thing," moved his head in something like assent. His motions were not slow. They were paced by a metronome he had not known existed. Every movement had already happened and was happening and would happen, and he selected the version that belonged to now with a care he had not had as a man because men can afford to be careless in time, and this could not. He stepped out of the ring. The dead parted as if he were a knife through a layer of frost on water that did not wish to crack but was being told by its own nature that it must. He went to Ghost and put his hand to the wolf's head. He did not feel the warmth of fur and skin the way he had before, but he felt the shape of warmth, and his hand adjusted to that shape the way ice will sometimes wear a stone like a ring. Ghost closed his eyes. John did not. He could not, because the Oversky had no lids and he had become part of its will. The wolf made a sound that was not a whine and not a growl. It was the sound fresh snow makes when something living rolls in it and claims it. He turned to his companions. Speech came differently now. It was not pushed. It did not set the air dancing in frantic patterns. It laid down like a track on a field, a narrow dark that would persist long after the foot had passed. "I hold," he said. The words made frost on their own breath. "You go," Tormund grunted. He said. "I reckon we will." He looked at the pale riders, curiosity and dislike wrestling in him and neither winning outright. "What do we call you then, if you need calling?" The question turned toward him like a bird that might peck or might sing. John thought of every name men had put on winter to feel brave in its presence and how those names had not warmed anyone. He thought of the word king and how the word wanted to sit and be important. He thought of the word night and how men used it when they wanted to scare children into staying by the fire. He thought of his first name, the one a man had murmured in love and pity, and his second name, the one the world had thrown at him with a sneer that he had learned to wear like a garment, and the name he would not let the world take from him now because it had been made with a blade and a vow. "Snow," he said, and the pale riders stirred as if the wind had changed direction, and how generous of it to warn them first. "Call me Snow." Arya took a step forward then. "Brother," she said in the tone of voice one uses to pull someone back from a cliff. She launched the word as if there was a target. "Don't be clever. I know what you're doing. You think if you make a truth of what they called you, you take it out of their hands. Don't give them this one." He did not smile because smiling would have broken a shape he was trying to hold. He gave her a little tilt of the head that only she would see and understand. "All right," he said, and the breath of the word shivered the snow on one of the stones so that a small slab slid off and shattered on the ground. He looked at the pieces and did not take it as an omen because fate is men's way of saying they weren't listening. "John," he said, "when you must." Howland cleared his throat. "You will not be able to leave. I think you know that. The hinge must be where the door is." John nodded. The movement was terrible and beautiful. "I will be where the cold is honest," he said. Sam wiped his nose on the back of his glove. "If we make a pact, a new pact, if we write it down in ways that the world can read," he swallowed. "Will that help? Will that make it so you can not be this forever?" The last word broke in his mouth and made all the more noise for the effort he took not to let it. "I don't know," John said. And part of him had learned to love not knowing because knowing here was a promise and he had run out of promises he could live through. Make your pacts. Keep your dead with love and not hunger. Stop building things on bones and then pretending you didn't know. Stop asking winter to discipline your enemies and then weeping when it comes for you. Put your fires where fires belong. I will hold while you remember how. Arya's face went white with wrath and grief in equal measures. "I will go south," she said. He knew at once that she was not fleeing. She had decided to take the fight somewhere. "If anyone thinks to make use of this, if any lord or lady or dragon queen thinks to make a name off my brother's bones, I will cut the name out of their mouth and make them eat the whole." She had never been and good at poetry. He loved her for it. Tormund snorted. "We'll be back up this way when the snow melts enough to let a man walk without growing shorter with every step." The big man put his hand on Ghost's head too, and Ghost accepted it because there was no point in refusing care where there was no bargain attached to it. "You send if you need us. I don't know how you send now. You figure it. You always do. You'll be a right bastard about it, I bet." They went. The dead did not watch them go because watching implies a kind of need that the dead did not feel anymore, not with a mind on them to keep them from wanting. John watched. Something in him kept count the whole way, not of their steps but of what would be needed to keep the snow from biting them to bone. He eased the wind without thinking. He smoothed the ice under their horses' hooves. He let the sky give up a little light it had not planned to offer that afternoon. He would be careful with those gifts later. Now he was new. Now he was human enough to cheat. When they were gone, he turned to the riders of pale light and thought their order into new angles. Some stayed at the circle, a brace on the fresh-welded joint. Some went out into the flat world, to stand where the ice remembered it had once been a hand on the land and not a tooth in its throat. Some went farther, to the places the old wounds had tried to hide, because you can tell a scar to lie to you if you like, but it will not be better for being hidden. They went without question. He had thought he would feel power like a rush, like drowning in a river of something men wanted enough to die for. He felt instead responsibility, a weight the size of the sky that made him more still than he had ever been. That night, if it was night, for time had become an arrangement of breaths and pauses, and he had discarded his need for it as one discards a cloak when one finds a house with a fire. He felt the first of the living come to the edge of what he now kept. It was a fox. Only a fox, one might say, if one had never watched a small body make a life with only wit and speed and hunger to argue with weather. The fox came sliding over the ice, clever feet testing, eyes bright, and paused at his shadow. It cocked its head and looked up, not with the awe of men at shrines but the practical evaluation of a creature who has learned everything has a price but knows some prices are worth paying. He bent, though he did not need to bend, and let the fox come nearer and closer still, and when it took a breath of him he let it have what it asked for. A piece of cold without teeth, a night without wolves, a curve of wind that would put it on a path where the snow lay shallower and the rabbits had used the same corridors thrice. The fox blinked, made a sound like a question mark, and ran. He did not watch it go because there were bigger matters than kindness. He held on to kindness like a rope. The first humans came 3 days later, or 3 lines of weather, depending on how one counted, and they came under a banner only sometimes raised in the past years, a field of gray crossed by a dire wolf that howled toward a horizon painted with a thin white line. Sansa had sent them, and they came the way a letter comes when the writer knows where to send it. The men were not many. That was good. They carried a chest. When they opened it, its breath fogged the air and hung there heavy with spice and tallow. There were candles inside. Fat ones, thin ones, some made from the fat of animals whose names had forgotten they were animals. A boy with a split lip and a careful, cautious way of standing in his body stepped forward and set one at the edge of the circle. He did not look at John's face. He looked at the ground, at the old snow, at the small wrongs that had sought to cover themselves and had not succeeded. "For those we would keep," the boy said in a voice that was not quite done growing. He struck flint and steel and lit the wick. The flame shocked the air and then settled into the work of being small and persistent. The boy's hands shook. He held them behind his back so they would not embarrass the flame. He lit a second candle for those we have lost. He lit a third for those we cannot yet name, because to name a thing is to cut it free from the dark, and sometimes the dark is safer for it. He did not say that part. That part lived in the way he breathed. John felt the candles as a new kind of weather. Fire had always been an opposition. Now it was also a partner if it remembered where it belonged. He bowed his head the slightest fraction, not to the men who had brought the chest, not to the candles themselves, but to the idea that someone south of his cold had thought to answer it with light that asked nothing as grand as victory. He nudged the wind away from the small flames. He did not ask the men to stay and warm themselves at a blaze, because warming was not what he did anymore, and because warmth in the wrong places breaks things that cold would preserve long enough to be fixed. The messengers left him a letter wrapped in wax and tied with string. It had no seal. He did not open it because letters are for hands, and what he had become did not know how to read one without tearing it. But the wax picked up impressions. Someone had pressed their thumb into it as if to say, "I touched this paper with my living body. I own this request." He touched the wax with a thought, the way a man touches a sleeping child's forehead to see if the fever has broken. He smelled, though smell was not what he had anymore, the bitter clean of rain, the ghost of onions fried in a kitchen. He saw, though sight was too small a word for what now entered him, the color of thread knitting a tear in a sleeve where someone had caught it on a nail. He knew Sansa had sent the letter, and that the words inside were all pragmatic. Measures and measures, muttered in the tongue of stewards who found in numbers a way to keep their loved Ness alive, but that the string had been tied by the same hands that had once knotted a child's hair to keep it out of her eyes and had not done it kindly. Another set of messengers came later wearing a different banner, a dragon with 3 heads dancing on a tide that did not want it. They brought no candles. They brought no letter. They brought a question. The question came in the shape of a man with a soldier's walk and a scar on his cheek like a river on a map, and in the shape of a woman who had learned to speak 4 languages, none of which the wind liked. They did not kneel. They did not stand too near. The man spoke in a way that made you trust him because he made you think he trusted you. "Our queen would parley," he said, and the word steeled itself as it left his mouth. A door that expected you to walk through it without looking. She would meet you at the wall. There was no wall. There were pieces of wall set into the world like remembered teeth, and there was the suggestion of wall that memory puts into a place where a wall once stood to scare people away from making the same mistake twice. There was no wall because the old law had been broken, and law is often what men call their fear when they build it higher than they can climb. John tilted his head and asked the man a question without speaking. "What would she do there that she cannot do here?" "Walls are for meetings," the woman with him said, and her mouth shaped the words with the careful massaging of a person for whom each consonant carried meaning. "We do not put our heads in weather if we can help it. Also, the wall is a thing we can take down and put back up. It reminds men of their work." It surprised John that the impulse to smile lived in him still. He did not indulge it. He gathered the dead around him like a cloak and sent necessity into his voice the way a smith puts temper into metal. "No," he said. The word made the air thinner for a moment and then let it be. He let the dead around him heel in close, not menacing, merely present, a law in white that needed no argument. "She cannot ask what she means to ask here or there. She wants to ask me to stop being what I am so that she can be what she wants to be. She cannot ask because I cannot answer, and if she sees I cannot answer, She will be angry at the answer, and then she will forget the question. He looked at the man until the man's scar stopped being a mark and became just flesh again. Tell her to make new laws where she is. Tell her to hold the living kindly, and I will hold what is mine. If she sets fire to a tree to warm herself, I will not begrudge her. If she sets fire to a forest because it stands where she meant to march, I will take the fire out of her hand and let her learn how to be cold for a while. The messengers were competent. They did not argue with weather. They bowed because bowing wastes less time than dying, and left their footprints for the snow to digest. So it went. Days, if days were the number of times the light changed its mind. People came and they brought what they had. A song in a tune winter could hear, an oath, a chunk of old stone to be built into a new wall. A story about the way their grandmother had wrapped a child in a shawl and told him that the snow is only paper until you tear it. He liked that story. He thought of tearing a thing too often in youth. It pleased him to learn there were ways to treat the world other than by force. When he slept, if sleep is what one calls the moment when the mind stops looking outward and turns the mirror inward to see whether it still exists, he dreamed of a hearth. The hearth was not his. It was stone and straw and sudden silence and the smell of onions and tallow because Sansa had told the cook to make the onions last. It was the clatter of cups. It was Gilly laughing when Sam tripped on a book and did not let the book fall. It was Arya's knife making small, elegant shapes on a piece of wood that would be a wolf when the shape inside let itself be revealed. It was Bran's chair creaking like an old boat on a river that knew how to carry things without dropping them. He dreamed also of a hall made for kings in a city that had forgotten it was a graveyard. A hall full of people who had learned the art of lying with grace so that they could survive their own truth. There were dragons on the roof. There were quiet women at the doors. There was a queen with her hands on a tabletop, fingers splayed, as if the table had tried to move itself away from her, and she had persuaded it that bolts and nails were less honest than the weight of her body. He did not dream of himself at all, because he had taken a form one does not see in the small mirror humans carry within. He did not miss himself. That frightened him less than it should have. The first letter he understood was not sent with wax and string or with men who seemed to work for a living. Came out of the trees. A raven landed on the point of a stone and looked at him with a gaze that suggested the bird would be disappointed for days if he had become boring. Croaked once. Its breath showed in the air. It shook itself, then spoke with a human voice that had a boy's highness and a depth that came from speaking where no one wanted to hear you. You should come in out of the cold, Bran said, and if it was meant as a joke, the raven delivered it like a commandment. I would show you what is walking toward you. Jon did not move. Moving was irrelevant. The raven flew to his shoulder and dug its claws into a garment that was not cloth and did not tear. It leaned its weight on him. There were dozens of other ravens in nearby trees. He had not seen them gather. One sees birds when they decide to be seen, not before. He left himself where he stood, a mind large enough that it could be in two places at once without either place losing definition and become less than it had been. Then he stepped into the skin of the snow that lay in the go. Swooed and looked through the face carved in the heart tree. Winterfell's gods would met his gaze with the same lack of deference the lake had shown. The weirwood did not blink out of politeness. It let him view and be viewed. Bran sat beneath it, not in his chair for once but cross-legged in the snow like a boy waiting for someone to return with bread. His face was sharper than when Jon had last been close to it. Boys become men when they learn which things to let pass through them. Bran had chosen to let everything through and been scraped hollow by it, and still he did not complain. Sansa stood behind him with her hands folded, and she was wearing gloves she had stitched herself because other women's gloves did not fit her. And he understood in a way he had not before how much of Sansa was work she had done in a room alone. Arya was not there. He felt her in the yard throwing knives at an imaginary throat, and he thought to himself that throats had not been imaginary for her in a long time. "Show me," he said, and the weirwood carried the words to Bran in a way that felt like drawing a blade across sap. Bran put his palm to the trunk. "There are 2 winters," he said, and each syllable caught on his teeth as if the words had burrs. "The older and the new. The old one is a rule the way gravity is a rule, the way a mother loving her child is a rule. Then there is the winter men make and think they are very clever about. That is the winter I told you about, the one that would spill. You have tied the new winter into the old so that it cannot run. That is good. John waited. Patience had become simpler when he stopped having to tell his own heart not to rush. The old winter. Bran touched the tree again, not for company but to keep his hands busy. It has a judge, a woman who remembers what it means to give and ask for bread at the same time. She is coming to your door because she thinks you owe her a story. The boy's mouth twisted. Humor did not belong on that face, but it appeared there sometimes like moss on stone. She is a child, not like the ones you killed with fire, but she will tell you that you have her brother's crown. She will not be entirely wrong. Jon thought of the pale riders, of their eyes, of the weight of distance in his limbs when he walked now and the way the air moved aside politely, as if told an important person had entered a room. He thought of Crown and felt the old thought that had been a young man's rebellion flare inside him and then die of its own lack of air. I have a duty, he said. The old winter thinks it made you, Bran said. The new winter thinks you are its servant. Decide. If you let them decide, they will hand you back and forth until you are a splinter in someone else's teeth. The raven on his shoulder tore a piece of something invisible from the air and ate it. Also, Bran added after a beat in which the snow found a quieter way to fall. The queen is building fire in a place where fire does not belong. Cannot stop her. She is not wrong to do it if she only looks at now. She is always looking at now. You were good at looking at then and later. Between you, perhaps there is a way. Jon let his gaze, such as it was, fall past Bran to the surface of the pond, repaired from the last time he had stood there and broken by falling leaves. A fox had crossed it, and the prince made a meet-cute with the prince of a cat, and then both trails vanished and reappeared in different orders. He did not ask after Daenerys. He knew better than to ask a prophet for gossip. He let his mind move toward the south like a wind that remembers streets and finds its way between them. He found the city that had eaten its kings and pretended not to burp afterward. He found the Red Keep and its carpentering. He found the room where a table had been carved into the shape of a whorl so that a hand on it could claim ownership of whatever the hand covered. He found the queen with her hands on that table again, her hair braided like answer keys, her lips moving as they counted soldiers, as if soldiers were numbers and not the ways men outlasted their own fear. He sent a breath north, then south. She did not look up. She would later, when the breath stole a candle's flame and she had to tell herself it was a draft. He did not trouble her now. He had learned that troubling the living when they were busy loving their own decisions did nothing but make them furious at the wrong thing. He drew back into himself. The ravens left him like bits of torn shadow. Bran sighed. Sansa looked at the tree as if it owed her an apology for bleeding in her yard. Whatever she builds, she said without being asked, we will be ready for the heat and for the lack of it afterward. She touched the bark and then pulled her glove away quickly, as if the sap had burned her. What about you? I am here, Jon said. He could see the words form behind her eyes. He could see how she would put his sentence into her ledger and measure its weight and feed it to her people without asking them to notice what it had cost the hand that held the spoon. He did not say he missed her. He did not miss anyone the way humans mean. He held them. He held them at once, and if he thought of the warmth of their hands, it was only like a man thinks of warmth in a painting, a memory of heat that does not warm and does not need to. When the child came, she did not come alone. The small ones never do. They bring with them the woods that made them, and the water that taught them to sound like wind under doorways, and the age that men like to pretend is theirs when they are old enough to be allowed to sit at a table head. She came out of the trees not like a person but like a chorus. Her hair was the color of things that will be green later. Her eyes were gold and not gold, but the shade leaves make when sun is only a story told in winter. Her fingers were stained with resin and blood and the juices of fruits that had no business still hanging on boughs so far north. She was not beautiful because beautiful is a word men throw at the world when they are trying to be forgiven for wanting it. She was something that had not decided whether it wanted to be looked at. You carry him, she said without preface. teeth small and neat in a small neat mouth that would bite through any finger you offered it. You carry our king and our error and our hope. We are grateful. We are angry. We are grieving in ways you would not forgive if you had ever been responsible for the time before yours. But you have not. John did not bow. He did not stand tall. He was tall now only in the way the sky is tall, by being where it is and letting small men claim that height when they point up and say the silly word up. He let the cold deepen and then relax. The pale riders did not move, but he felt their attention stack like stones. I carry what is mine, he said. I keep what men will break. I keep what you broke when you were men by accident and power on purpose. Her smile was brief and without pleasure. Men, she said. She took a step toward him until her toes touched the edge of his shadow. If shadow is what you call a part of the world that declines light. You were what we had when we ran out of patience with the way the winds go. We carved your faces into trees and taught your feet where not to fall. Then we saw you were busy making names for what we had done before you, and we asked the trees to say nothing. That was our first error. We liked you too much. We gave you your lies back when you brought them to us corrected. She looked him up and down in the frank assessing way of a maker disappointed by the work but not ready to admit to the tools that her hands had slipped. You can hold this, I see. You have chosen to keep. Good. Choose to give. When you learn where to put back the things you have taken, winter will be you as much as you are it, and the difference will not matter anymore. I've put back what I could, he said. I returned men I did not mean to take. I asked the snow to keep the bones safe until their names found them again. You ask too much. We always will, she said, and in it there was almost a kindness. She took from around her neck a small circle made of something that might once have been wood, then bone, then stone. She placed it on the snow between them, a gift and a threat. This belongs to whoever remembers how to use it. It belonged to him before. Do not wear it in your hair. Do not call it a crown. If someone calls it a crown, take it off and bury it. If someone calls you king, inherit their fear but not their name. She cocked her head. There is a heat building to the south that will soften your edges. Do not let them soften. A thing that softens too much breaks. He felt her go before she moved. He realized then that the dead had become a chorus behind and around him, restless without moving. A choir of cold that wanted to sing not about killing but about composure. He put one hand out toward the pale riders. They calmed. He put the other toward the ring, toward the small circle lying on the snow. He took it into his palm and felt in the small, weary thing a memory of a winter where men and not men had agreed about the meaning of a path. He held it, and when he felt the urge to hang it about his neck, he lay it down on the ice beside the first candles brought by Sansa's boy and let it be warmed by their small patient flames without melting. He had just enough warmth left in him to find that a miracle. The days passed in a slow hinge turn. He learned the shape of a blizzard and how to undress it until it was only weather. He learned the sound farmers' spades make when they hit ground still too cold for planting and how to lay a breath over the field like a blanket and tell its stories until it loosened. He learned the names of avalanche and crack and mineshaft settling, and spoke to each of them in a dialect of cold that had not been spoken since the first men's first hands had warmed themselves over a fire stolen from lightning. He learned to keep the dead not as an army, though he could have, but as a reservoir, a great dammed river that would, if kept well, turn watermills the living had not yet built. In his stillness he found a patience that would have frightened him as a boy, because patience in a boy looks like surrender, and patience in a man looks like knowing. He watched over the winter the way a shepherd watches over sheep whose wool is needed by strangers. He did not love the sheep. He loved the work. South, the queen burned a grove in a storm and did not hear how the burning trees sang. North of her, Sansa put a man in a cell because he had stolen bread twice and then took him out of it because the bread had been for a child and made the man watch as she showed him how to grind flour without wasting any, and in so doing humiliated him more than any beating could have and made him grateful enough to keep from stealing until spring. Arya took a knife to a girl's braid because the girl had cut it herself badly and was crying with anger at the clumsiness of her hand, and the knife made a new shape out of shame, a shape the girl could wear without flinching. Sam wrote and wrote, and then, when he ran out of ink, spoke to a boy and taught him letters using burnt sticks in a wall. The old winter watched the new winter and was not displeased. When spring came, it was not the untying of a knot. It was a loosening and then a letting go. He did not do it. He permitted it. There is a difference. He took the edge off mornings. He let fog lie long over rivers that had learned to go softly. He set his dead where the melt would be quick and made sure they stood on rocks so that when the ice ran back into the ground it did not suck them down. He made space for the first thunder. He put down all the wind he had been holding and told it to go south and be rain in a place where men ha. D tried to ask the sky for mercy by setting fire to its nearest thing. He learned he could be soft where softness was required and be not less for it. The first living man to come through the melt to him unafraid was a shepherd from a hill north of where the wall had thought itself important. He had a lamb in his arms. The lamb's eyes were like blackberries in cream. The shepherd's hands were cracked in lines that had been there since he was 12, and they extended their networks further with each frost. He walked as if the ground might leap at him and take the lamb, and he would not blame it for the theft. He stopped at the outskirts of the circle of stones and held the lamb out like a gift to a god that had not asked for worship. "It got born wrong," the man said, eyes not leaving the lamb's shivering belly. "Feet backward. I pulled it back from the dark, but now it coughs when it should sleep. You have winter. I have this small thing. I thought." John reached out and took what the man offered. The lamb gave a weak, offended bleat. His breath was too hot. It would die of what that heat meant. He put his cold into the lamb with a control that would have impressed any maester, and the lamb blinked and quieted. He did not take the heat away entirely. He respected the work the fever was trying to do. He made room. He handed the animal back. The man cried as if a hand had left his throat. "Thank you," he said. Then, after a long pause that meant more than the thanks, I'll tell them you keep, not only take." John dipped his head. A small thing. He was learning to treasure them because large ones broke. He went back to the work of weather. He held like that through a second spring, and a third, and found that his fear of forgetting himself had been only the fear of losing a story he had liked about his name. He did not forget. He changed. Men think those are the same. They are not. The dead behind him were a collected silence that made the living's noises into music. He shaped that silence when asked. He never asked anyone to kneel for it. When the queen came north at last, she did not bring an army. She brought a dragon. The other had gone unpredictably into the sky one day and not returned, and the white that had eaten it then had not been his white, and she had learned from that to keep the living she depended on within reach of her voice. She rode the dragon in a kind of sadness that sat on her like a garment fashioned by a woman with a needle in each hand. She did not land within the circle. She hovered as if preparing to leap a gap from roof to roof. Her hair moved restlessly in the wind he had chosen for that morning. Her eyes were pale with fury and pale also with something like hope. Hope's last cousin who keeps the house when hope dies. "Show yourself," she called, and the dragon's scales caught the light and threw it back at him like knives. Her voice did not echo. He did not give it the courtesy of unnecessary repetition. He lifted his head. She looked at his face and flinched, not because it frightened her, but because she saw in it nothing she could take in her hands and break or make. Power without purchase. She hated it. She had learned lately to hate anything she could not bend into a shape she recognized as victory. "Did you think," she asked, and her voice broke on the question, "that you could do this forever without me finding reason to object? Did you think I would let you be the story north of my story?" He considered telling her about the shepherd and the lamb. He considered telling her about the boy with the candles and the small circle the child had left on the ice. He considered telling her that kingship was a game men made up to keep other men busy while women did the work of living, and that being a hinge had nothing to do with crowns. He said instead, because he owed her a more immediate respect than those arguments offered, "I did not think about what you would let me do. I thought about whether the dead would stay dead and the rivers would rise and the things we have broken would be mended without more breakage." Her eyes flooded with tears. She refused. She blinked and burned them away. "You chose to be winter," she said. "You made me be summer. If I am summer, I will be it thoroughly." The dragon hissed, a question and a demonstration. She raised one hand and made a small, precise gesture as if drawing a letter in the air. Fire licked at her fingers as if the flame were a dog that knew its master's scent. "Don't," he said softly. The word was a snowfall over a sleeping town, a blanket laid by someone who had learned the right weight for a given house. "Don't tell me not to burn," she said, and her laugh was the sound glass makes when it is drawn thin over the surface of something it will eventually cut. "It is all I do that people call good. You took from me the one winter I could have ended with my own hands. You don't get to tell me what to leave alone." "I will not tell you," he said. "I will stop you." He made no gesture she could read. He let the sky learn gentleness for the first time in months and lay itself on the dragon's back like a second skin. The dragon felt it and screamed, not with pain, with offended force. It flung its body sideways. She handled it. Of course she did. She turned the dive into a spiral and would have set the ground to rights with her heels if she had landed. She did not land. She hovered again, higher, and looked down on him with a gaze that saw both a stranger and the thing she had loved too long to forgive. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. She pressed her fingers to her lips as if to keep the words in. When she took them away, her jaw shook once and then stopped. She wheeled the dragon and went south without saying anything more. He did not call after her because calling after a proud thing merely gives it a reason to pretend a new insult. He turned to the dead and set them in EW geometry. He stood in the strange peace that follows a battle not fought and let the world count his breaths for him. A raven came down out of a balsam fir, a tree that had no business in that cold and had yet made a life there because someone had dropped a seed in a warm summer long ago and looked away, and landed on his wrist. "You could have killed her," Bran said, and the way he said it made of the possibility a curiosity, like remarking on a patch of mushrooms that might be poisonous, might be bread. "I could have," Jon said. He sent a breath to Winterfell because Sansa was walking alone on the inner ramparts and telling the stones a story they had not asked for. The breath smelled of a storm that would not land on her household if she spent her flower wisely. He waited for the raven to answer because he had learned that silence draws better meanings out of a person than questions do. "She will go find a thing to burn that will hurt you without you being able to say how," Bran said at last. "She will call it justice or mercy until everyone is tired of waiting for her to pick a word." "I know," Jon said. "You will let her," Bran added, not a challenge, a statement. "You will let her because you think the pain will measure you. You will learn from that. It will not be what she wants you to learn." "I know," Jon said again, and he lowered his head toward the circle where the first of the candles had burned down to limp wicks to see whether the little circle the child left had absorbed any of their heat and whether the absorbing made it less itself. It had not. He felt something against his chest, an ache where the shard had gone in and made room. Not pain, place. He put his hand over it and held still, and Ghost came up behind him and leaned his heavy head against Jon's hip, and for a while they too were the world. A wolf and a man-shaped winter, and between them the kind of waiting that makes space for every kind of future, even the ones no one will want to claim. Night by night, the living took their lessons or did not. A lord burned a forest to cure his fear of ambush and found his walls sheathed in ice that would not melt even when his wife held a candle to it and cried because their baby needed warm wood to sleep near. A woman in a village gathered her dead with names and sowed a field over the bones, and when the wind came to lift her hair and make mischief of her thatch, he sent it around her home as a hedge. A band of thieves tried to pull up the small circle he had laid near the candles, thinking it a gold thing laid down by careless hands, and found instead that their fingers grew too numb to learn a lesson and left before they could decide whether to be better. Children played at winter in the yard of Winterfell and learned to make snow houses so sturdy they slept under them when summer came and refused to move back into the castle like civilized people. Sansa let them. Arya threw knives at the walls of those houses when the children were gone and was surprised and pleased when two stuck and did not fall. He began to realize, with a slow pride that complicated itself with shame the way butter complicates bread, that the winter he had taken into his bones was reshaping men not only in the way they feared but in the way they did not. It made their fires purposeful. It made their generosity better because it made food more precious and therefore kindness cost something. It taught them to write things down because memory fails more often when fingers are cold. It taught them to use what they had, which was to say each other. He liked that. He held like a hand under a pot so that it would not fall. And yet, for all the slow gains, the threats gathered the way clouds gather when mountains think they will be ignored. Men in the South used his name as a joke or as a totem to frighten a woman into bed or a child under a blanket. The Queen found new ways to test his silence and new fields to warm with fire that would be dry as bitterness next year. Into these habits, deep and old as any winter, he sent no white sword yet. He kept, he watched, he prepared for the moment. Keeping would not be enough. It came not with an army but with a rumor, a melody in a tavern. A song that called him king not because the singer believed it but because the word rhymed with the next. That would not have mattered. Songs in taverns vanish like beer spilled under tables. What mattered was the ear that heard it and chose to be hurt. One night, a night in which the aurora made a fool of darkness and men went outside to point and be made small with joy. He felt a prickle across the white like a hand drawn the wrong way over fur. He turned his attention to the place where the prickles came from and found a band of men with torches walking on a field far to the east of what had once been the wall. They sang as they walked because singing makes fear learn your name. They were not mercenaries. They were neighbors. They were coming to pull up the small circles men had placed at their border to remind themselves they should not waste their dead. Because someone had told them those circles belonged to him and therefore to winter and therefore to a kind of surrender they would not permit themselves. Their anger steamed in the cold. Their breath rose and braided itself into a rope. Someone had gathered that rope in his hands and given it a purpose. John followed the rope south and found, at the other end, a man in a keep. No, not a man, a boy, though boys act like men when given half a title and a whole thirst. Holding high a scrap of paper with words that said the old pact was treason, that a wolf kept north had taken their names, that mercy was in fire and manhood in refusing to be bound to any law but one's own hunger. He could end this boy. He could drop a frost on the keep from a clear sky and call it an accident and tell himself he had saved lives. And he would not be wrong. He did not. He moved his mind back north to the men with torches, and he extinguished the torches one by one the way one pushes fingers into a string of beads until they snap and scatter on the floor. The men stopped singing. Their breath turned white and settled on their mustaches. He made the air still. They listened to the quiet with the sudden humility that only cold gives. One of them laughed, and then another, because a man who is not warmed artificially will cling as hard to laughter as he once clung to meat. They turned and went home, and the circles remained in the ground where careful hands had laid them. He was nearly content that night when Bran sent a raven with 10 words arranged like a knife. She is coming north with wood to set your trees alight. He turned then, in mind and not in body, to the one place he had chosen never to point himself, to the fire at the center of the Queen's breathing. He found, as he had known he must, that her story and his were now wound so tightly around each other that a tug on one changed the other's shape. He moved gently to avoid tearing either. He made of his cold a room. He made of his room a chair. He set himself in that chair and decided to be patient. Patience, he had learned, divides the number of your enemies by the number of your grudges and leaves you with a remainder small enough to feed without going hungry. The Queen came, as Bran said she would, and she came not with a dragon but with men, and not with soldiers in neat lines but with woodcutters and carriers and little carts stacked high with cords of wood that had been dried and stacked and dried again. She arrayed them at the edge of his weather, and she lit the first pile herself, and she stood watching as the flames ate, and she put her hands out not to warm them but to feel the heat as if to answer the cold with her skin and a dare. She wanted him to stop her. He had not realized until then how much she loved being stopped. It gave her a shape against which to push and made her more herself. "Don't," he said as he had said to her before, and maybe the sameness of the word enraged her. She did not answer, and she fed another log to the flame. She had chosen good wood. The fire took it quickly and gave back a handsome heat. Men warmed their hands and forgot to glance behind them at the slow creeping hunger of the ice. That was all right. He would remember for them. He stepped into the fire. not with his body. He placed his mind in the heart of the blaze and let the heat try to teach him something about eagerness. It did not. He had been eager. He remembered the flavor of it. He let the heat lick at him and could not forget he had once loved it. He did not feel pain. He did not feel righteousness. He felt only the clarification that heat gives to things that are meant to endure it and the destruction it gives to things that have no business near it. He whispered to the flames. He told them that their work was good and that he would not have them starved for it, but that their work here was done and now they should go where it was truly needed. He told them about a village 2 days south that had lost its chimney to a storm and about the mothers who had been sending their children out to gather twigs not because twigs made a good fire but because they made the children feel like they had done something. He told the flames about those children and how their fingers were chapped and about the way their mothers had learned to pretend to be warm. He told the flames a story about a man in that village, a miller who had hoarded and had then, in the night, broken his own door down from the inside to take his hoarding to a neighbor and how that breaking had embarrassed him and freed him both. He sent the fire there. It went. It was honest fire. It did not listen to queens. Daenerys stood with her hands outstretched and watched the logs sink in on themselves like old men. Watched the flames do what flames do when cold counsels them to be specific about their loves. She drew her hands back slowly as if she feared the cold would catch and hold them like manacles. She looked over the field of neat piles waiting their turn and 1,000 men standing with their hands open to nothing. Her face learned something then. It was not humility. It was not wisdom. It was knowledge of limits. And for a moment her mouth softened into the mouth of a woman who had fed hunger before she fed ambition. He loved her then as he had loved her when she had kissed him for the first time and smelled of saddle and wind and the coppery exhilaration of having done something only a handful of human beings had ever done and survived. He loved her and did nothing with the love. That was new. Very well, she said at last, not to him, perhaps not even to herself. She turned and raised one hand and made a circle in the air. Men at the far line of woodpiles began to break down the stacks and load them back on their carts. They were not happy. They were workers. They would talk about this later with women who knew how to burn anger slowly until it kept a house warm without turning it into smoke. She walked a few paces into his weather and then stopped and looked down at her feet as if his cold had come up and seized her by the ankles. She tipped her head back and looked into his face and did not flinch this time. "Hold," she said. "Hold then, and let me build. We will see which one feeds more people and therefore wins." He did not tell her that winning was not a word the world used when it talked to itself in honest moods. He let her walk away. He learned what the scent of olive oil smells like when it has traveled a month in a wagon with a woman worried about keeping it safe. He learned from her a new kind of restraint and took it as seriously as he took the old packs. Time learned how to be around him. It does that, eventually, for anyone who insists upon a shape long enough. The thing that killed kings in the south was boredom, and the thing that makes kings in the north is patience. He took the slow ways and let the quick ones break themselves. He sent his dead where dead were needed, not to terrify but to persuade. You would be surprised, he would have said to a younger him, at how persuasive silence can be in a house where everyone has been shouting for years. He did not forget the children put to bed under snow houses in summer. He did not forget Daenerys's fingers circling a flame like a falconer's call, and the way the fire had obeyed him and her both and neither. He did not forget the small circle left by the child and its knot crown, warmed by candles. He did not forget his name. He did not say it aloud unless someone else needed to hear it. And when, at last, a rider came from the south in the height of summer with a letter that had the breath of a red keep baked into it, a letter written in a hand that had not forgotten how to be cruel because cruelty gets results when it is carefully applied, a letter that said, "Come, just once, to the wall and speak to me and show me a way to be something other than what I am without making the world pay for my education." When that letter came, he lifted his head and the dead behind him stilled, as if the choir expected the conductor to raise his hands. He considered. He felt the hinge in him ready to turn. He gathered the cold like a cloak and walked north along a path worn into the light by his new way of being until he stood where the wall had once bared its teeth. He breathed. The summer under him grew quiet as if a child had stopped crying in another room. He looked south, and he looked at a line men would call a horizon, and he made a place for a queen to stand if she chose to, and a place for a brother to stand if he remembered a world where winter was not an enemy but a season. He waited, and the waiting made of him a country no one had ever ruled. He waited, and in his waiting there was a future shaped like mercy and like war and like every way in which a man and a woman and a season might agree to share a world without making it smaller. He waited because that is what keeps due, and he held, because that is what a hinge is for, and the crowd of dead behind him sang a song that had not yet learned words, a song of stillness, a song of possibility disguised as cold. He waited until the summer licking at his ankles remembered it was a guest and sat down, and then he smiled, not with his mouth, but with his weather, and let the day lengthen without heat, and wondered, not with hope, which is an arrow, but with patience, which is a shield, what would come up the road he had left clear.